She is an assistant professor at WMU who holds joint positions in the Institute of Environment, Geography, and Sustainability and in the Department of World Religion. Her research focuses on the intersection of ecology and religion. In her book, Faith, Hope, and Sustainability, The Greening of U.S. Faith Communities, she explores the role of faith communities in creating a more just and sustainable world. Dr. Shattuck is also active with People's Church, our sister Unitarian Universalist congregation across town, where she's part of the Green Sanctuary team that is constantly working to move the church community further along the path to sustainability. She also serves on the leadership team for Hope for Creation, where we have many people connected with Hope for Creation today. That is the Southwest Michigan chapter of Michigan Interfaith Power and Light. So welcome, Cybelle.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I will hopefully be semi-coherent in spite of a week spent grading papers, which is getting harder now that half of them are written by AI, which is bad. And so I thought we'd have to talk about data centers tonight, amongst other things, but we'll get there. So when Eric reached out to me about joining the Thoughtful Thursday conversations this year, one of the things I was thinking about was I was part of a project a number of years ago when I was at the University of Michigan to actually develop climate adaptation materials to be used in the Great Lakes area. And at the time, the idea was that we spend so much time thinking about climate mitigation, how to reduce our fossil fuel use and stave off the worst effects of climate change. We actually put less effort or less energy into thinking about how do we adapt. And as we know, adaptation has become a necessity because we have not prevented the climate crisis from moving forward, even though hopefully we are doing things that will make it not as bad as it could be. And of course, right now, due to circumstances, it's really good to focus on the state level because that's where the good action is taking place. So I was thinking about this topic and reflecting on how there was a minister, a Lutheran minister actually, that I interviewed out in Wisconsin, who had wonderful environmental programs at his church. It was a really interesting church because it was a collaborative project where Lutherans and United Church of Christ were sharing a building and had done so since 1970. And on that property, they had restored prairies and they had solar panels on the roof. They had community gardens, food pantry gardens, all kinds of wonderful things. And he commented that so often when we talk about the climate crisis and what we're trying to achieve, we simply talk about it as if we're trying to make things less bad. And his theory was that if that's the way you think about it, you start out, you're scared, you jump on the bandwagon, you want to do something, but it's not very motivational to just be trying to make things less bad. And he thought one of the things that the faith community really brought to the climate conversation was a tradition of envisioning what is the good thing that we're striving toward? What is the better vision of society that we would like to see? And how do we try to get there? And so I was thinking that that might be our focus tonight, to really sort of envision not just what are we trying to make not bad or not as bad, but also can we envision a future that we would really want to have so that young people like Arias have a joyful and wondrous life and get to thrive in an environment that supports them. So that's where I hope we'll get tonight. But I thought we'd have to go back and start with this idea of adaptation and then think about how to ensure that justice and a wholesome community are part of where we get to. And I don't know if any of you are looking for silver linings these days, but my my hoped for, since things are being torn down to a much lower level than I ever expected, we're going to have a lot more scope for building up to something new. So maybe this is a chance to think about what that would look like. And since we're a small enough group, we can have some conversation along the way as we do this. So when we start thinking about how our lives are going to be affected by climate change, we start by talking about, the way the environment we live in is shifting. And of course, one of the things that we're all already experiencing are the changes in the weather. So our climate systems are adjusting. And so we talk about how one of the biggest factors that we are facing going forward is this risk of heavier precipitation events along with longer dry spells. So as you probably all know, this rain that we're experiencing this week is actually rescuing us from a drought that we're in that was actually quite severe. And that's not something that Michigan has a lot of experience with, drought. There have been a couple over the years. There was a very bad one back in 1988. And there's another one about 10 years ago, so we do get them. And so when you think about heavier precipitation, I mean, heavier rainfall mostly, sometimes heavier snowfall, but that in some ways is easier to deal with. What are some of the risks? What are some of the things that we experience when we get really heavy rains around here in our community?
Just unmute and pop in with that answer. Is that the idea?
Sure, let's
I'm
have a
going to say
conversation.
flooding.
Flooding is a big one. Yeah,
Yeah, the road's getting impassable.
right. Has it ever occurred to you how lucky we are in Kalamazoo that we have one hospital on each side of the river? That helps with climate adaptation, right? Even if the roads are flooded in such a way that you can't cross the river, you're still going to be able to get to an emergency room if you live in Kalamazoo or Portage.
Well, we were close to that the year of the flood when people were kayaking under the railroad bridge. I kept saying, how do I get home? Because if I'm on the east side.
Yeah.
And I think there was one road I could take within a reasonable distance. That would help me. Yeah.
So one of the first effects of flooding is really short term. It's transportation. How do we get where we need to go? What else happens when we have floods?
Well, the crops suffer.
Crops will be damaged. If the rain falls at the wrong time of year, we get a lot of damage to crops. And I don't know about you, but there are places where I just look at the cornfields that get planted in the spring and I think, well, that farmer is really an optimist because that low corner, why even bother to put plants there? It's going to be a pond with ducks on it in another week, right? And then we also get the soil runoff. So we get erosion of the topsoil that takes away the fertile layer of soil in the fields when we have these heavy rain events, which can have long-term problems.
We also get a lot of houses that flood.
Houses flood.
In Lakewood, that's low land there, and it always
Yes.
floods with rain.
Has it occurred to anybody that Lake Street does not actually border a lake? It just turns into
Seems
one.
to be a lake.
Yes.
It rains.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have these wetland areas that have been paved over and now they turn into these ponds. So we have that whole Crosstown Parkway over in the southern edge of Kalamazoo. And of course, if the home floods, what do we have in our basements? Oh, just all of our expensive appliances, right? Right. And so we can see in the city this damage. One of the other things we don't notice as much is the pollution from the runoff, which is a sort of downstream problem. But you think about if you have a farm with fertilizer or pesticides and herbicides on its fields, those are running off. You think about the little bits of rubber from our tires that are on the side of the road are getting carried into our waterways, the drippings of gasoline and oil on our roads.
Out west,
Um,
we had mudslides.
yeah, mudslides. And if we have those concentrated animal feeding operations, which we do have a few around Michigan, or we have the rendering plants up in Plainwell, and they have these big lagoons of waste that can then overflow and go downstream, and those often are heavy nutrients. So then you get disruption of the aquatic watershed, and you get algae blooms and things in the lakes. So we get a lot of damage from these. So obviously we need to do what we can to address flooding risks. And this is one of the places where um, we can start thinking about, well, what would be some of the ways to address this that would actually make our communities better, right? And so you think about, okay, what if we restore our wetlands? Because they capture the water and then they slow it down so it flows out slowly. And in the process, restoring those wetlands, we're restoring habitat for all kinds of wonderful frogs and fairy shrimp and the ash trees that grow there that are used in indigenous baskets, and it's habitat for wildlife for the birds that migrate through and need waterways to stop on. Or we also think about the areas along our rivers where maybe we've got brownfields from industry that we can clean up and turn those back into green space, that then if the river rises, it's not going into somebody's house, it's not blocking a road, it's going into what we've turned into a park that
What
can
do you
absorb
do with
that water. And think
people?
of all the benefits we get from that, right? So we're
Sybelle, what do you do with the people who are living there?
Oh, well, I wasn't saying I'll go there in a minute,
Yeah.
Nikki. So I'm thinking more about, we have so much industrial space along the river that is just being unused because it needs cleaning up. And if you're going to clean it up enough for a house, you have to clean it up to a level that's really expensive. But if you're going to cap it and turn it into green space in a park, you actually don't have to spend as much money to remediate it. There are, if you go to downtown Lansing, you'll find some parks where there are little signs telling you not to dig in the soil because it's former brownfields. But it's good enough for parks, right? And so then you've got green space, which improves outdoor access space, but you also get extra benefits like if you're planting trees, those help to shade the water, which keeps the water temperature lower, which helps the fish and aquatic animals survive when we have higher temperatures that are going to come with climate change. Um, and you're improving access to recreation space. You could be improving access to safe bike travel routes that are not on the roads. So there are ways we could envision this to have all of these benefits while trying to mitigate the flood hazard. Now, Nikki, you bring up a really good point. Whenever we get one of these big floods in Kalamazoo, there are certain houses that flood. And what we've seen in some communities is that instead of rebuilding those houses, sometimes they help those people move. Sometimes you can build the houses differently. You can raise them up, put them on stilts, things like that. But if they're really in a floodplain, probably the best thing is that they aren't there. And so there have been different projects people have done depending on the town. They had massive flooding along the upper Missouri one year, and using FEMA money to recover afterwards, there's one town where they said, well, this is our historic buildings, they have to stay where they are, but we're going to elevate them and make it so that if water comes up here, it can go underneath without damaging the building. And if you think about it, a lot of the old houses on the north side of Kalamazoo that were built by Dutch immigrants, they have those really high foundations, right? And so those houses actually could probably withstand flooding if we can do things like swap out the furnace in the basement for a heat pump that's on the exterior of the house and is elevated off the ground. And then maybe make sure that the washer and dryer and things like that can also be upstairs instead of in the basement. So you could adjust houses if you have historic housing stock that's worth preserving. But you could also try to move people. And there was one town, they had a neighborhood where the demographics of the neighborhood had shifted so that the elementary school was no longer being used. And what they did was to remove the school, and then they actually lifted up and moved an entire block of houses. So they were moving people uphill with the idea that everyone got to keep their neighbors. They weren't disrupting the neighborhood. They were just putting it in a new location on land that had become available. Now that's a little extreme. It might be easier to just build new houses. But if you're in a house that's flooded frequently, it's probably not in very good shape, and a new house might look pretty good. So there are creative solutions people have come up with when you do have houses that are regularly being flooded. So it's something to think about. Obviously, you can't just tell people to move. You have to work with them. They have to want to do that. But thinking creatively instead of just assuming that there's nothing that we can do about it. And then, of course, trying to mitigate the water. So if we restore wetlands, if we plant more trees, if we do things that will help slow down the water as it goes into the streams, that gives us maybe reduce the flood hazard. Because in Kalamazoo, we had some flooding about, what is it, 5, 6 years ago now? And it was almost 10 years after the previous major flood. And what was so interesting was to look at the damage assessment and see how much lower the cost of the flooding was in the more recent flood than in the previous one 10 years before, even though the flood actually got higher. The waters were actually higher on the Kalamazoo River this time. And so it showed how the city had actually built up roads more. Some businesses had moved out of the area. Some houses had been removed. And so there was less of the infrastructure to be damaged by the flooding the second time around. The flip side of that, the dry seasons, a lot of the same things that help with flooding can actually help with dry seasons. So you think about if we have a longer dry season and we have a lot of heat, who suffers from that? I don't know, but I confess that this summer I escaped from some of the Michigan heat and I went off and hung out in the High Sierra where it was quite pleasant.
So are you talking about like the poor and the elderly? I mean,
So
inner cities?
I don't know about the rest of you, but I feel as the more gray hair I get, the more heat bothers me. Yeah, so one of the things we know is that as older people's bodies actually have more trouble with heat than younger people's bodies. And also people on some medications that will affect their ability to handle heat. And then you also think about people who work outdoors. So that's a major factor as well.
People who are in the middle of the city as opposed to out in the country.
Right. So we have this urban heat island effect where all of the pavement concentrates the heat and makes things worse. And of course, farm workers are in one of the categories, farm workers and construction workers. So construction workers may be in that hot urban environment, and then farm workers are out in an area where heat's going to make air quality worse because there's more dust. But also they're working in an environment where they may really not have access to shade.
In Arizona, the construction workers work early in the morning, take a 4 or 5 hour lunch, and then work again in the evening. They get their full day in, but it's in 2 very distinct time frames.
Yeah. Yeah. And have you noticed here in Michigan, we seem to get a lot of road work at night now? And I know part of that is because the traffic's lighter, but I think part of it's also because heat can make it hard to work with asphalt. It gets sticky. And so it's probably mostly for the traffic, but it's I mean, those horrible Klieg lights, right? But here again, we start thinking about, okay, are there ways we can start mitigating this? As Nikki says, one of them is changing the work system for people. And one of the things that's a little dispiriting is that it turns out states actually have to set regulations around that, or businesses don't always think to do it. So we probably need policies that actually have temperature triggers, where you say if the temperature rises above this, then you have to give your workers shade, you have to give them extra water breaks, you have to, think about adjusting your hours so that they won't have to work in the hot part of the day. Things we never thought we'd worry about in Michigan. We way up north. But then you also start thinking about how could we mitigate that urban heat effect in ways that might actually create a city that's more pleasant to live in? So planting trees, right? Trees are amazing. And it turns out that the city of Kalamazoo actually now has a policy where they're trying to achieve what they're calling tree equity, whereby all neighborhoods would have at least a 40% tree canopy. And so there are obviously some neighborhoods that already have more than that. But there are others where sections don't. And Kalamazoo is a lot better than someplace like Baltimore, where the difference between the middle class neighborhoods and the low income neighborhoods is just astonishing. And the heat differential's 10 to 15 degrees. It's ridiculous. We actually do have nice parks and trees in all of our neighborhoods, but there are sections of the neighborhoods where there are fewer and you get more heat. And often that happens where there's an apartment building. So increasing urban tree canopy reduces the heat effect, but it has other benefits, because then if you have those trees, it actually helps water go into the soil. So then it helps reduce the runoff going into the streams, so the streams don't rise and you don't get as much flooding. You can, along with reducing the temperature, you actually improve the air quality, because trees are magic and they capture and absorb pollutants. And you're also providing habitat for wildlife. And of course, wildlife and the natural systems they've become somewhat neglected lately in our discussion about climate change. We're always talking about energy, and yes, it's the fossil fuels going into the atmosphere that are causing the dramatic changes in our environment. But another piece of what's happened is that as our natural systems have been degraded, they're not storing carbon in the same way. They're not as able to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into the soil. And so the more we can do to build up and strengthen our natural systems, the more it helps them regulate the Earth's carbon cycles, while also improving moisture management and planetary cycles. So it's the win-win, right? And how many of you have read one of Doug Tallamy's books or saw one of his presentations recently? Where he was talking about the oak trees and the different trees, but specifically the oak tree, how it's habitat for so many different species of insects, which then makes it habitat for birds. And as I recall, he said something like, you need 1,000 caterpillars to raise a chickadee. And I had to do a mental adjustment, right? Because normally you go into your garden and you see the caterpillars have been eating your plants and you think, oh, rats, it's a bad thing. It's like, no, it's a good thing. The caterpillars are feeding the birds. I had to adjust my attitude towards the tomato hornworm, which has got to be one of the scariest looking caterpillars ever. And you know how it is, right? You're growing tomatoes and you're so excited because you've got all this fruit, and then for a week or something, you neglect your garden and you go back out and it's like most of the leaves are gone and something's been taking bites out of your tomatoes. And you stare at the bush and you stare at the bush and you stare at the bush and you can't find it. And then suddenly you see it. And then you wonder, how did I not see it? Because it's 4 inches long, half an inch wide. It's got a little red tail. And then you try to grab it or something and it curls up its little front legs, which makes it look like they have white tips, and suddenly it looks like it's got teeth because of the way the legs are aligned, and it makes this ominous clicking sound. I know it's only 4 inches, but it's really intimidating. I mean, you could use this for a horror film. And so, you know, you pick it off the bush because I would share my tomatoes with the tomato hornworm if it would just eat one whole tomato. But no, it takes a bite here and then it goes to the next one and takes a bite and goes to the next one and takes a bite. They don't share. So, so I had an antipathy, you may have guessed, for tomato hornworms until I discovered that they're related to the same caterpillar that turns into a hummingbird moth.
Mm.
Have you ever seen a hummingbird moth? The first time I saw one, I really thought it was a hummingbird because of the way it was moving to feed out of the flowers, but it was too small. It was only like, you know, 1.5 inches. And so I had to look it up and I discovered there's a moth called the hummingbird moth, and it comes from a caterpillar that's very similar to the tomato hornworm, and they're in the same family. And then I looked up the tomato hornworm moth, and I discovered it turns into this beautiful moth. And so I had to recalibrate. So I've decided even they can have some of my tomatoes. So, but thinking about how to create habitat that helps people thrive and also helps nature thrive so that nature can help us restore the balance of our planet that we've really messed up. And so trees, and one of the things I've really been thinking about in our area is so many of our congregations have started putting in native plant gardens. I think I heard Sister Ginny that where the mother house used to be, there's now going to be a restored prairie put in.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
wonderful. Yeah. You and the sisters are such great keepers of the earth and have done so much to preserve the ecosystems up there on your property at Nazareth.
Thank you.
Well, they let the whole north side go wild. I was driving there and it's like, they had the big pasture across the street from the mother house. It's completely wilded now. Trees are coming up there. It was really impressive when it registered, you know, because I drive it every day, but it registered all of a sudden. Oh my God, they haven't mowed it. Yeah. And it was really neat.
Yeah. And so I've been thinking about that we need a project to actually map all of our lands, the lands that are managed by faith communities, and then to map them and also map how they relate to our other green spaces, the various parks and natural areas that we have here in Portage and Kalamazoo and the surrounding townships. Because I think what we'd see is, yes, we all have our little pieces where we're doing good things, but together we're creating this amazing network of patches. And then we could think about how to connect them more so that the species can move through these areas and really have greater resilience because they can migrate through these areas that we'd be restoring. So I'm delighted. Like Prince of Peace has amazing grounds out back, and I understand they've had trouble with some young people hanging out there and engaging in less than desirable behavior. And so clearly we should restore it with prickly native plants. And a lot of us, you know, we've got some native garden space, but we still have a lot of lawn. So there's a lot of room to expand, right? A lot of room to expand. And so many people come to our properties. So we have great opportunity to educate. And maybe one of these days, someone somewhere will manage to convince my husband that native plants don't look like a weed garden. So Arias, you have a question. Yes, that's very important. And I'm glad you're here so that you could bring this into our conversation. Because when we talk about these negative effects of climate action, one of the things we often don't think about is, if there's a flood and we need to evacuate people, how do we make sure everybody is able to move to safety? People who have mobility issues, people who don't have access to their own transportation systems. And then as we create these green spaces, how do we make sure they're accessible? So as we plan these native plant gardens, I think it's important to make sure that we include pathways and that we think about having ways that people can actually get into them and enjoy them without having to wear hiking boots, right? One of the things that we recently did at People's Church was we realized we have a memorial garden, but it didn't have a paved walkway. And if people wanted to go and visit the memorial wall, they actually had to cross the lawn, which meant it wasn't accessible. And so adding a paved path there was really important to us to make sure that anybody who wanted to go and visit that space would be able to do so. So it's very important that we think about also, how do we make sure these spaces are navigable for people if they have vision issues, to make sure that people can walk safely and the roots of trees can be a hazard. So thinking about how to make sure spaces are open to all of us. And I think most of our churches, we have to follow some of these regulations, but we think of them in terms of the indoor space, and we don't always think about them as necessary in our outdoor spaces as well. It was one of the issues that came up in Flint with the water crisis. Originally, they were setting up the water stations at places where you needed a car to get to them. And then they realized, well, that wasn't going to work for everybody, right? And so it was often the houses of worship that then were stepping forward and saying, we can be the distribution center because we're right here in the neighborhood, and we have volunteers who will help to go to the houses of people if they can't come here themselves. And so that's one of the places where the faith community actually is able to serve people. And it comes to another thing that I've been seeing as people are thinking about climate adaptation is a lot of faith communities are turning their buildings into resilience hubs because they're in the community, but they also have space that may not be fully utilized every day of the week. So they then can make that space available for things like, if there's a power outage, can they have backup power systems, and then people can come and store their medicines in the refrigerators, in the kitchen, charge their phones so they can be able to communicate. A lot of our communities have showers, or we may be able to actually set up some of our indoor spaces for cots so that people can stay during difficult times. And that's another reason that it's nice to think about, how many of us have roofs that would be good places for solar panels so that we can have backup energy during difficult times. There was some discussion about this back when we did the climate justice, when we had the big Unitarian Universalist climate justice events. And I was thinking about how a lot of these resilience hubs, when churches are putting them in, they're in big urban centers. Around here, these might need to be collaborative projects where it's not just, one congregation has to do the work, but partnering with others to share resources around these events or to share the volunteer work of opening space and maintaining it for people, because we're smaller than some of the places in Detroit. One of the issues that comes up around climate change, of course, is energy. And there's a movement in Michigan right now to talk about energy equity. And the here the idea is that nobody should have to pay more than 6% of their income for their energy bill. But if you look at the statistics for the state of Michigan, 25% of Michigan households pay more than that. And some of them are spending as much as 20% of their incomes just on their energy bills, basically keeping the lights on, keeping the furnace on. And so this energy equity project, one of the things they looked at is the rate difference on average between the rates that we householders pay for our residential energy versus what commercial institutions pay. And so the average electric rate for residential customers for energy systems at DTE and Consumers Energy is about 18 cents. Whereas for commercial, it's 13. And so there's a suggestion out there that maybe if the commercial rate went up just 2 cents, that extra money could be used to offset the costs for the other 25% of Michiganders to bring them below that 6%, which would be relatively easy to do. So we're probably going to see some efforts to have some proposals around that coming up soon. So something I just wanted to get on your radar to be watching for going forward.
When you say there's going to be proposals, who's making these proposals?
So there'll probably be a proposal in the legislature.
Okay.
Yeah. There's one in the legislature right now that I thought you'd all be interested in. It's called POCA, P-O-C-A, not like the dance, which stands for Protecting Overburdened Communities Act. And the idea of this is that currently when we have the siting of any heavy industry, truck traffic, or other sources of pollution, what we know is they're already disproportionately placed in Black, brown, and low-income communities. And so we get the pollution concentrated. And so the proposal here is that when the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy reviews permits, that instead of looking at them individually, so if you go in and you say, okay, I want to build a factory, they look at, okay, will your factory exceed air quality regulations? But what this POCA Act says is you have to actually look at the cumulative effect. So not only are you going to analyze whether that factory exceeds regulations, but you're going to look at what is the air quality in this area already like. And if it already isn't meeting air quality standards, then you're not adding another factory, right? And so the idea would be that instead of reviewing a permit individually, you have to actually look at the neighborhood, the public health, the environmental harms, and the cumulative effects of all of these. And this proposal has been put forward by Senator Stephanie Chang, who's over in the Detroit area, and Representative Donovan McKinney has put the one in the House. So it's in both the House and the Senate. And it's basically sitting in the Energy Committee, not being discussed. So,
Energy Committee in the
so
House
Sean
and the
McCann
Senate.
is on that committee.
That's what I was going to indicate. So it's the Senate, he's chair.
He's chair of the Senate committee, yeah. I can send you a link to more information about this, but this might be one where if we just want to start saying, hey, even over here in West Michigan, we think this is a good idea. We support the people in East Michigan who have proposed this because we also have neighborhoods where we know people carry an unfair burden, and analyzing permitting processes with this information would be a good idea. And in the bill, I went and I started reading through it. Basically the regulations they're using are all already part of Michigan's environmental justice system. So many of you may know that in the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, we actually have an environmental justice office, and we have a person who is the designated advocate for environmental justice in the state. And when they created the Michigan Environmental Justice Screening Map, they created a set of criteria that looked at things like demographics, so you have income levels, but it also looks at, like, do you have a really high proportion of elderly people or people under the age of 5? It has a section on health issues and things that affect people in an area. So they keep track of asthma, other respiratory issues, heart issues. There data that's available through the Michigan Department of Health. And then they look at the sort of cumulative environmental effects as well. And so it's not hard to actually do this kind of assessment because there's already a mapping tool out there that provides this information for the state and tells you where the hot spots are and where things already exceed these regulations. So it wouldn't be putting more work on anybody to do this, really. Just being required that they consider it. So I'll send you all a link to that later, or I'll send it to Miriam and she can send it to people.
Sounds
Because Miriam knows everybody.
I try. Is there a risk of when you're using those kind of that kind of data of development ending up in rural areas where the air is clean and you don't have the same regulatory stumbling blocks?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I was looking at some of the maps of rural areas, and some of them I think would actually qualify almost. The only reason they don't get considered environmental justice communities is because they're white, right? Because they have air quality issues and water quality issues, and many of them are low income as well. So I actually think a cumulative assessment like this might work for them as well, because you'd have to be looking at those cumulative environmental conditions. And even though they wouldn't fall into the having a large proportion of people who are a minority, that you'd still, I think you'd see that they're burdened by many of these health and environmental issues. But it's a really good question. And in fact, I think it's one of those things where, okay, the data centers. Are you hearing about the problems with the data centers?
Pavilion Township would be one of those less built up areas, I would think.
Right, right. So we have this interesting scenario emerging right here in Michigan where basically about a year ago, maybe a little more, Gretchen Whitmer actually signed a bill that would make Michigan very hospitable for data centers, that they would get all these tax breaks if they came to our state. This summer, the University of Michigan put out a report where they did an analysis, and basically what they discovered is that tax rebates have nothing to do with where the data centers go. All that does is mean that they move into your neighborhood and cause a lot of harm without giving you any benefits in return. So that was probably a really bad policy decision. Now, the thing with the data centers, I try not to let the disaster of what AI is doing to my students. I lost a bet, basically. I told my colleagues, environmental studies students love what they're learning. They won't cheat. They did. Right. The essay exam is coming back all over the place because we can't let them write outside of class because they don't do it themselves. It's very distressing. So the interesting thing, these data centers are going in because of AI. And we have smaller ones in Michigan. We have a bunch of them. But these new ones they're talking about are on an extraordinarily vast scale. There was one, it was described as basically the equivalent of 18 Walmart supercenters. It's hard to picture that, isn't it? It's like, okay, even if it didn't do any damage to anything else, what does that do to the stormwater? All of that impervious surface. And we're already worried about these precipitation events. So that's an issue. But then the big problems that people are seeing is that we were making progress in this country towards reducing our electrical usage. And that was going to make it possible to ramp up the renewables to meet our electrical usage. so that we could get off fossil fuels. But a few years ago, because of the AIs and these data centers, our electrical usage started going back up again. And so even if we build renewable energy, all we're ever doing is be meeting the new uses. We're never getting down to where we can get rid of the old uses, right? It's a climate change disaster. So that's one issue. Another thing that happens is when these data centers are being built, because they need so much energy, that the local power company then has to add energy infrastructure, which then means that all the ratepayers pay a higher rate because we all pay for the construction of the additional capacity, the increased power lines. And in Pavilion Township, if you've been reading about it, there's this the response to the people in the Pavilion Township who are saying, we're worried that our electrical rates will go up. Somebody said, oh no, they can't just raise your rates. That has to go through the Michigan Public Service Committee. They set the rates, so they can't just raise your rates. It's like, yes, this is true. It just means there will be a lag of a couple years before your rates go up. Because as we know, every couple of years, DTE and consumers go to the MPSC and they say, we need to raise the rates, right? Because we're building all this new infrastructure. And I'm willing to put up with it when what they're building is solar fields. But what's happening here is that there's a loophole in the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan that talks about the state's goal of having 50% electricity be from renewables by 2030, which is coming up very quickly, and 100% by 2040. And the loophole is, if for some reason they can't meet that, if they can't meet the need for electricity with renewables alone, then there's a loophole. They get to keep the fossil fuel plants going. And we're seeing with these data centers going in that some of the data centers, the companies are literally just buying the coal power plant and putting their new data center next to it and using it to power the data center. So that's the other piece of the energy part. Rates will go up with new infrastructure to handle the data center, and then it may mean that the fossil fuel plants have to stay online to meet this demand for energy. And so they'll tell you, our commitment, Google, is that, we're going to power all our data centers with 100% renewable energy someday. But meanwhile, they're going to use whatever they can get. And to be fair, they are paying. Apple and Google, these companies have paid to put in a lot of solar and wind capacity around the country. But as their need goes up, it's insufficient, right? And also they have to have backup systems for when the sun isn't there, when the wind isn't there. Some of those are batteries, but a lot of them are putting in masses of propane generators. And then they test those regularly to make sure they work. And so you get all this propane pollution that is then going into the air every couple of months when they run the tests on these generators, even if they didn't actually need to run them to back up the power itself because the power wasn't out. So that's one issue, is the energy. Another issue is the water. They use massive amounts of water to cool the computers. And I think that's one reason they're coming to Michigan, because we have water. Because many of these are going in places without a lot of water. The New York Times just had an article that was talking about Querétaro state down in Mexico, which has a bunch of these centers. And now the people are talking about there are water shutoffs and there are electrical outages, and that those have increased dramatically since these AI centers, these data centers have gone in. So I don't want to say we shouldn't have all AI. I mean, there are some things we're using it for that are really beneficial. One of probably the most useful is that they're now developing AI systems to help read medical imagery. So looking at MRIs and CT scans and things like this, it works really well for that. And those uses actually don't use that much electricity. It's a very limited data set. It's a relatively simple process to use. It's these large language models, the Chat GPT, the things that are messing up my students and making it so we're going to have a whole generation of young people that can't read. Those are the ones that we're not thinking through how we're using our energy or what the best uses of this technology are. So I think the upside is this is new, and we have the opportunity to set regulations around these before this gets ahead of us. So that University of Michigan study, it suggested a few things. One of the things, if you read about Pavilion Township, or there was another proposal over in Howell, one of the things that just shouldn't be allowed is that these companies are negotiating with township boards, but they're also requiring non-disclosure agreements so that the people they're negotiating with in the local government are told you can't tell anybody the details of this project, right down to how much energy they need, how much water they need, how much space they need, or often even the name of the company.
Mm.
It's like, wait a minute. This is a democracy. These people represent us. They shouldn't be making decisions without giving us all the facts. So we need a mandate for transparency. The community has to be provided with the information so they can make informed decisions. Then it's been suggested that we should have a regulation that says if you're going to build one of these, you also have to provide the funding for the renewable energy to be built to power your system. You can't be contributing to climate change, and you can't be creating a scenario where we have to keep some dirty coal plant going, polluting our ecosystems, polluting our lungs, continuing to add mercury to our waterways so that we can't even eat the fish that people catch in our ponds and our rivers. So, demanding that they provide their own energy or pay for the provision of that energy so that it won't hurt people. But also, I think we have to have a discussion about what are appropriate places to put something like this.
They
Right?
also don't have to be water cooled.
That's true. They can be air cooled, but then you use so much energy running the fans
If
that,
they're on renewables, then they run the fans, Having it water cooled is contaminating the water when it comes out of those plants, and it's using too much water per plant. We are currently in a drought, even though we've had these rains. The droughts are going to get worse. It's affecting our farmers. And if we start using the water, because they're not going to go up to the lake and pipeline it in, they're going to be using our aquifers, then, no, I think we should be zoning it. It cannot be using water. It has to be off grid with renewable energy. And it has to be in an industrial center so that the noise doesn't affect the neighbors.
yeah.
I
And I
think
haven't even seen any studies yet asking how that noise and water use
no, there's
affects
been
the
a lot of
ecosystem.
complaints about the noise going, from people who have been living near data centers now. That,
Yeah.
that they weren't expecting that. It should be quiet, but apparently it's very noisy.
Yeah. No, the fans are extremely noisy.
So, we could building in these regulations now before they come to the state. And they have the money, they can be doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have heard some of them use a closed loop water system, which I'd like to see more evidence. That at least wouldn't necessarily contaminate unless there's a
Right.
leak, which there probably would be because pipes always leak. But it does seem like, we should get ahead of this. We're getting these proposals and we don't have good regulations that can help communities evaluate the proposals.
And if
And
it's a
so,
closed loop, it has to have refrigeration, which also uses energy.
right. Yeah. So this is one where we probably need to ask our representatives to start drafting legislation now that we've got things like this Michigan study where we can send it to them and say, hey, let let's not be cleaning up after the fact like we've done so often in the past. Let's actually get ahead of this one. Because it doesn't matter where they go. I mean, it doesn't have to be in Michigan for Michiganders to use it, right? It's Wi-Fi, it's internet stuff, it travels.
But that
So
also uses electricity.
yeah,
It's all of it, the cloud, the things that we're looking at right now. It's all
yeah,
part of it, and part of it's making our lives better and trying to, as we build this just and equitable world. I was thinking about accessibility.
right.
That a lot of the newer tools are making life easier for people, and how do you balance that?
Hmm.
I was speaking about data centers to my daughter, and she, if we, look back on the development of the automobile, yeah, it was probably a bad idea for the planet, but it has made our lives so much easier. And how do we balance that?
Yeah. Now you think about I mean, part of it's the size thing, right? Do they really need to be that big? It seems like smaller versions have been doing pretty well for us for a while. So these really massive ones, maybe, you know, there have to be rules about where they go, and it can't be in a fragile ecosystem. It can't be where it disrupts our water flows. It can't be where it changes the temperature by creating a giant urban heat sink that's then going to have all these effects. Um, yeah. So there's a lot to think about with this. Michigan, in some ways, it's a special state. Maybe the only other one that's similar to ours, because of our water, and so much of it's on the surface. And so the way we care for our environment is different than in some other states because they don't have as much risk of water contamination as we do. Yeah, as Arias says, it's an access tool. But there's concern about the jobs that are going to be replaced, and that a lot of those are jobs that may be done by people with disabilities. So, in the Amish community, they have this idea that technology should be evaluated before you decide whether to adopt it, right? That you should think about what is important in life, and for them, it's to live according to their religious values. Um, And if technology will fit with that, you can adopt it. And if it's going to interfere with that, you don't adopt it, or you do it in a different way. So for a long time, they didn't have telephones in their homes, but they had a phone booth down the street. So you could communicate when you needed to, but you didn't have it interrupting your family. There's more electricity in households now, actually, because of computers being useful for so many things to run a home business, banking, all of that sort of stuff. But thinking about when it's useful and when it isn't, and do we have to just leave that to market forces? I'd like to think we could create some regulations to help with that. I don't know. I don't know where this one's ultimately going to go. I do feel like the energy use is unsustainable.
Well, you got the data centers, you have the Bitcoin mines, you have even just the large service centers, like Amazon and those huge warehouses that they have. They're all hogs and low paying and few jobs really. And
Right.
AI
Yeah,
is
they
really,
always sell them saying there will be jobs,
right,
but most of
AI
those
is going
jobs
to
are for
turn the whole
custodians.
economy upside down
Yeah.
because we're going to lose a large number of jobs once AI takes off.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
when I think about my vision for a just and sustainable future, it includes less machines and more people.
yep, that's not the way we're going.
No, no, it isn't. Remember, that was Gandhi's thing. that he didn't think India should try to replicate the Industrial Revolution of England because India was rich in people, and those people needed the dignity of work, and all work should be equally valued.
Yeah, and AI is already cutting jobs, so.
Yeah, one of the things that's going to be interesting, I think we all heard about the business up in Grand Rapids that laid off 200 people. And then the speculation is how many they'll have to hire back when the AI program they're buying actually doesn't turn out to be as good as those people were, which seems to be likely to happen in a lot of places because many of the companies that have developed pilot AI programs ended up not implementing them because they didn't actually seem to be that beneficial after all. I hope that continues to be the pattern. But yeah, this is a big one. I mean, I think, as Nikki says, if we can get ahead on regulating the centers, that's one thing. But thinking about how to create a community that is a place where people have the dignity of work and we can interact with human beings instead of bots. That's a
Well,
big challenge.
the other thing is really to really stretch the imagination. Do we really have to work as long as we have a living? If we have a minimum income society, then there would be people who want to work. There would be other people who want to be artists and can't afford to do that now. There'd be other people who might want to do conservation work that is not normally considered work. They might want to go live in the forest. So, we have this, because we are a work society, we think that the dignity of people is that they're, what they can earn and live. But if we have a minimum income, then a lot of people might not want to work. They might have other things they would rather be doing. As I said, you said stretch your imagination.
Yes. And maybe the problem is we only assign the term work to things that we get paid for.
Right. And why do we need that? I think we really should be thinking about possibly turning society upside down.
Yeah, when we think of the many hours that go into maintaining a faith community, most of which are not paid.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And if people had more time, they might be doing other things along those lines,
We are at about 8:15, and I wonder if there are any other people that want to pipe in and join
Sorry.
this conversation. I'm going to mute Nikki and invite you to ask questions and share thoughts about this idea of building a just and equitable and sustainable world.
I have is how can we get the youth more involved in environmental justice? I know a lot of nihilism about climate change, especially in the younger communities, that feel very powerless and don't feel like not using AI contributes anything. Yeah, so how can we get the youth involved?
Well, maybe we should be asking you that. Because I'll tell you, in the faith community, everybody says, we want intergenerational action. And we can't even get our own youth involved because they don't want to hang out with us. We're old people.
And I actually just came back from a conference where it was a disability rights conference for rural centers of independent living. And we talked a lot about passing on the torch because we need more youth in the movement, because young people have carried movements for a very long time. And I think one of the things is having those paid opportunities. It's very difficult to be a young person and find employment right now. And having the opportunities to do environmental justice or disability rights is just really important. There's just not opportunities to advance in employment right now. I think a lot of times people don't think youth involvement is worthy of money, or that the time should be compensated the same way as other involvement should be. And so a lot of times when there is call for action, it's volunteer based, and it's not rewarded the same, and it's treated as lesser than because it's coming from a youth experience. I know we talked a lot at the conference about having youth on boards, making sure that there's a youth position, making sure that there's youth steering committees, and just creating those opportunities, even if they're not paid, to have more youth voices speak up and feel involved so that they feel like they have skin in the game.
Thank you. It's great to hear from somebody who can tell us that it was young people making these suggestions, so it's not just, old people guessing. Yeah.
I know in the Unitarian Universalist faith tradition, there are a lot of young people involved in climate action. They were part of that lawsuit that wound its way through the courts, trying to sue on the basis that you're destroying our future, sort of thing. So, yeah, it's just creating opportunities and inspiring people to do the work. And fighting against that nihilism, I think that is a big, even with older people, the problem of climate, the crisis is so huge, you almost feel like, what does it matter if I recycle this bottle or not? It almost feels too late. So I liked the beginning of your talk that had a lot of ways to use our imagination to adapt and make things better than they are right now. Judy Halseth, you got your finger up.
Adaptation to climate change. That was at the beginning, just like you said, Miriam, and that was what really has stuck with me. And at my age, I won't live to see some of the outcomes 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 years from now. And yet, what can I do other than complain? Isn't it terrible that we're getting some more rain? But rather understanding this is how it is right now, and how can we adapt and help make the world a better place in whatever ways we can.
You can plant those trees that you won't be able to enjoy the shade of.
I've been trying to convince my students that the disaster we're living through might be liberating. I don't know that it works, but when I was growing up during the Cold War, I didn't think I needed to worry about getting a job in the future because Ronald Reagan and the Soviets were going to blow up the world anyway. So I could study whatever I wanted. I didn't have to think of going to college as career track. I could just study what I wanted. Unfortunately, or fortunately, fortunately, but I did have to get a job because the world's still here. But I've kind of been wondering if we could shift the nihilism into more of a live in the momentism, right? Find joy in what there is today, because none of us know what the future brings. One day I felt like my ear was stuffed up, and it turned out I had a tumor in my internal auditory canal, and it's like, you don't know something like that's going to happen. These things just happen. And that's actually one of the places where most religions have teachings about how important it is to focus on the present, and living according to one's values in the now is the way that we make life meaningful. My job is like the ultimate job in Nishkama Karma, right? Desireless action, where you do the work because it's important to do the work, or you think the work is important. It's your job to do it. But you can't be attached to the outcome because there's way too many variables. Did the student use AI? Did they not use AI? Did they get sleep? Did they not get sleep? Did they do the reading? Did they not do reading? All these variables are out of my control. I would love for them all to get A's, but other things happen, right? And so whether I do my job to do my job well because I think I value the job and I want to do it well, but I don't base my value of it on whether every student does a great job. Because I don't control all of those variables. And so you have to let go of attachment to the outcomes of what's going to happen with your actions and believe the actions themselves were worth doing. And I don't know if we can bring ideas like that back into a society that's become more and more secular. Where are the teachings about how to do this? But it's helpful, isn't it, to try to just, yes, I'm very stressed about the future. But if I focus on what I'm doing here in community today, I'm hanging out with this gorgeous group of people, right? And I have a cat that will come and snuggle with me tonight. And these are moments of joy. And I wouldn't give them up for anything, even if it's because the world around me is falling apart. So I don't know, maybe we need new books or stories or movies or something to remind people that even when the world's falling apart, we can find moments of joy to go with it. And that comes from our relationships, right? Comes from our community.
And I think that is just a beautiful place to end. That is just where we needed to be. You brought us around to the to the beauty at the end. So thank you so much. I do want to just tell you about a few things that we have coming up. I think we will throw up the slide about donations just so you can see that one more time. Take a picture of it or follow the link. You with me? There we go. There's our slide about that. And then our next Thoughtful Thursday will be November 20th. Our guest will be Daniel Oropeza. He is a organizer with the United Farm Worker Foundation, and he's going to be talking to us about those migrant workers, agricultural workers, and the challenges facing them. And then we have a bunch of other upcoming events at UUCC, including mindful living meditation with Eric Nelson, which is a great way to teach your brain to live in the moment and accept and find joy where you are. He's also doing a retreat on November 22nd. And then I do want to do a shout out for Hope for Creation's upcoming events as well. They are calling for climate change on November 4th. That's from 8 to 8:30. It's a Zoom call. You go in and you hear about an issue, and then they say, okay, here who you can call to talk about those data centers or whatever climate thing that they are doing. And our friend Molly will be leading up that call. And then on November 20th, they're going to do climate grief circles at, I had it written down and I've forgotten.
At Temple Benet.
Temple Benet, and that's from 6:30 to 8. And you can find out about all of Hope for Creation's events at hopeforcreation.net. And if you have not ever gone to any of their events, I strongly recommend that you become part of the larger community of faith organizations working for climate justice. So Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you, Cybelle. That was a wonderful conversation. So glad that you could take time to share your wisdom with us. And thank you all for being part of the conversation. And we will see you next time on Thoughtful Thursday in November. Take care.